Walter Brandt's father left him one instruction when he retired. The elevator belongs to the farmers. Run it for them, not for yourself. Walter kept it on a card in his desk drawer for 28
Walter, look at this
years.
graph. Anachronism
He read
is
it
at an
every
all-time
time someone
high.
offered
We have to
buy the
modernize
elevator.
to stay competitive.
He read it every time
That
the
farmer's
margins were
truck
thin
runs
and the
just
deferred
fine.
maintenance
But
list
we're
grew
losing
longer.
ground. The data
He read
shows
it when the AGP regional manager came with a capital analysis calling his 1962 equipment an anachronism. In September 2021, the computerized elevators went down. The chip shortage,
Steady now.
the heat
Keep the
event,
heat focused.
the parts sitting in a
It's
factory in
giving
Germany.
a bit more.
Walter's elevator,
Good.
the
Now check
anachronism,
the alignment.
processed
It's
2.7
holding.
million
We're nearly
bushels
there.
in 6 weeks.
This
The
load
regional
looks
manager
good to
came
go.
back,
Hold up.
not with
Before
an
you finish,
acquisition
sign
offer,
this.
with a
The
request,
resilience clause
and one
is this.
question Walter
It says
needed
your
answered
assessment
before
was
he picked up the
incomplete.
phone.
I see it
A
now.
grain elevator is not, in the common understanding, a complicated machine. It is a building, primarily, a tall building with a specific internal architecture, a series of vertical conveyors called legs that carry grain upward from the receiving pit at the base to the distribution system at the top, from which the grain flows by gravity into one of several storage bins arranged around the central structure. The receiving pit accepts grain from farm trucks. The legs carry it up. The distribution system routes it to the appropriate bin. When the time comes to ship, the process reverses. Gravity brings the grain down from the bins to the outgoing conveyors, which load it into trucks or rail cars for the next stage of its journey. This is the mechanical description, and it is accurate as far as it goes. What the description misses is what the elevator actually is in the life of the community it serves. An elevator is the place where a farmer's year is settled. Where the bushels that have been growing since April become the money that will pay for the inputs that will grow next year's crop. Where the moisture content and the test weight and the dockage assessment determine, in 20 minutes, whether the season was good or marginal or a loss. Where farmers wait in line in September and talk to each other about what happened and what might happen and what the price is today and whether it will be better or worse tomorrow. An elevator is a community institution. It is the post office of the agricultural economy, the place where the community's primary product enters the larger system. When it closes, something more than a building closes. Walter Brandt had been running the Millhaven elevator in Ellsworth County, Kansas for 31 years, under the ownership and with the guidance of his father Henry for the 7 years before that, and he had been in the elevator since he was 8 years old sweeping grain from the pit. In the fall of 2021, when the global supply chain was breaking down in ways that the agricultural technology industry had not anticipated and the sensor systems and computerized equipment that had replaced old mechanical elevators were failing in ways that nobody had a plan to fix, Walter Brandt's elevator, with its 1962 leg bucket system and its mechanical scale and its paper ticketing process, was the only elevator in a 60-mile radius that was still accepting grain. This is the story of what that meant, and who had said it wouldn't matter, and what happened when it did. Walter Brandt drove to the elevator at 5:30 a.m. on the first day of harvest, the way he had driven to the elevator at 5:30 a.m. on the first day of harvest for 31 years as its owner and operator, and the way he had come with his father for the 7 years before that when Henry still ran the operation and Walter was learning what running it meant. He was 68 years old, built in the square and substantial way of a man who has spent his life doing work that requires moving heavy things, with large hands and a face that the Kansas sun had worked on steadily for decades. He drove a 1997 Ford pickup that he maintained himself and that had 287,000 miles on it and that he had no intention of replacing until it gave him a reason. The elevator was a 4-bin structure built in 1962, the original construction that his father had supervised, expanded twice since then but never modernized in the way that the larger regional operations had modernized. The central leg bucket system was the original 1962 equipment, rebuilt twice and maintained continuously. The scale was a mechanical platform scale, calibrated annually by the County Weights and Measures Office, accurate to 10 pounds on a loaded truck. The ticketing system was paper, a multi-part form that Walter filled out by hand for every transaction. He had been offered money to modernize. Several times, over several years, by several different entities. Walter had looked at the brochures and had asked questions and had decided each time that what he had was adequate for what he needed to do. Not out of sentiment, out of the specific calculus of a man who understood both what he had and what was being offered and had concluded that the trade was not in his favor. His father had taught him this calculus. Don't upgrade, his father had said, until you understand what you're trading away. Walter had always understood what was being traded. The 1962 leg bucket system had no software. It could not be remotely disabled. It could not be updated in ways that introduced incompatibilities with other components. It could not fail because a server was down or a licensing agreement had expired or a chip was unavailable because a factory in Taiwan had been disrupted by an event that nobody in Kansas had anticipated. It could fail because a belt wore out or a bucket cracked or a bearing seized. These were failures he could fix, with parts he could get, with skills he had. In September 2021, this distinction mattered more than it had ever mattered before. Henry Brandt had built the Millhaven elevator in 1962, at the age of 34, with a small business loan from the Ellsworth County Bank and the specific conviction of a man who had grown up watching grain leave the county in someone else's trucks and had decided that the community needed to own the point where its grain entered the larger economy. He had chosen the equipment carefully, the leg bucket system from a manufacturer in Wichita who had been building grain handling equipment since 1934, the mechanical scale from a company in Iowa whose scales were in elevators from Texas to North Dakota. He ran the elevator from 1962 forward, and Walter came into the operation gradually, sweeping the pit at 8 years old, learning the sounds of the leg system through adolescence, taking on more operational responsibility through his 20s as Henry's attention shifted toward the financial and administrative side of the business. By 1983, when Walter was 30, he was running the day-to-day operations, receiving grain, maintaining the equipment, managing the seasonal staff. Henry remained the owner and came in daily until his health required him to step back, and formally transferred ownership when he retired in 1993. What Henry built alongside the physical infrastructure was the institutional knowledge of how to run it. The knowledge was, how to assess grain quality by hand and eye before the moisture meter was even consulted, because the moisture meter confirmed what an experienced hand could already feel in the kernel. How to read the test weight of a sample from the way it settled in the cup before the scale told you the number. How to manage the leg bucket system through the specific sounds it made under different loads, the sounds that told you a belt was developing slack before the slip became a problem, the sounds that told you a bucket was cracking before it failed. When Henry formally retired in 1993 and transferred the deed, he had one conversation with Walter that Walter wrote down that evening. "The elevator belongs to the farmers, not to us," Henry said. "We run it for them, not for ourselves. When you make decisions about the elevator, make them the way a trustee makes decisions about a trust, for the benefit of the people who depend on it, not for the convenience of the person managing it." Walter had kept this on a card in his desk drawer for 28 years. His name was Dale Whitfield, and he was 44 years old and had been the regional manager for the AGP Cooperative's Kansas operations for 6 years, operating out of an office in Salina and managing 11 elevator facilities across a 4-county area. He was competent and organized, with the specific professional orientation of someone trained in agricultural business management who thought about elevator operations in terms of throughput efficiency, operating cost per bushel, capital utilization, and competitive positioning. These were the correct metrics for what he was responsible for, and he tracked them carefully. He had been trying to acquire the Millhaven elevator for 3 years. The Millhaven facility was one of the last independent elevators in Ellsworth County. The others had been absorbed by cooperatives or regional grain companies over the previous 20 years as the economics of independent operation had become increasingly difficult. Dale had made 3 acquisition offers. The first time, in 2018, he had offered a price that reflected the elevator's asset value. Walter had said the price was fair but that he wasn't selling. The second time, in 2019, he had offered a higher price and a position as facility manager at the acquired elevator. Walter had declined again. The third time, in 2020, Dale had come with a capital analysis, the cost of maintaining the aging mechanical equipment, the OSHA compliance requirements, the market share data showing declining throughput as farmers drove to the larger AGP facility in Holyrood. He had used a specific word. He had told Walter that maintaining the 1962 leg bucket system rather than modernizing was an anachronism that makes sense for an operator at your stage of his career but that will create increasing capital pressure going forward. The mechanical equipment, Dale had said, pointing to the maintenance line items in his analysis, represents a liability, not an asset. The market has moved past it. Walter had listened to the entire presentation without interrupting. Then he had said, "The market has moved past it in normal conditions. I'm interested in what the market looks like in abnormal conditions." Dale had said that abnormal conditions were precisely the kind of scenario that a larger, better capitalized operator could manage more effectively. Walter had thanked him for coming and had shown him to his car. Dale had driven back to Salina and told his operations director, Gary Tanner, that Walter Brandt was either extraordinarily stubborn or had a fundamentally different model of what running a grain elevator meant. Gary Tanner, who had grown up on a farm in western Kansas, had said, "Probably both. Leave him alone. He'll retire eventually." Dale had filed this advice and had continued watching the Millhaven throughput numbers, which continued to decline modestly each year. The supply chain disruption of 2021 arrived in multiple layers. The first layer was the global semiconductor shortage. The shortage had been building since 2020, driven by the pandemic's effect on manufacturing capacity and the simultaneous surge in demand for electronic components across every industry. By late 2021, it was affecting the replacement component supply for the computerized systems that modern grain elevators depended on. The second layer was specific to the grain handling industry. Consolidation of the electronic control system market over the previous 15 years had left most grain elevators dependent on one of three major manufacturers. Two of these manufacturers had components affected by the semiconductor shortage. When those components failed and needed replacement, lead times had extended from the normal 2 to 4 weeks to 6 to 8 months. The third layer was an August heat event in central Kansas that pushed ambient temperatures above 105 degrees Fahrenheit for 9 consecutive days and caused thermal failures in the electronic control systems of 2 of the 3 AGP facilities in Ellsworth County. The failures had been caused by inadequate cooling in the control system enclosures, a known vulnerability that the facility's maintenance protocols had flagged but that had not been addressed because the replacement cooling units were on back order. By the first week of September 2021, 2 of the 3 AGP facilities in the county were offline. The third, the Holyrood facility, was operating at reduced capacity because 2 of its 4 receiving lanes were down. The estimated time to restore full operations, 6 to 8 weeks, depending on parts availability. The Millhaven elevator, with its 1962 leg bucket system and its mechanical scale and its paper ticketing, was running normally. Walter had opened the receiving pit at 6 a.m. on September 2nd, as he did every September 2nd, and by 8 a.m. he had a line of farm trucks that extended past the facility's parking area and onto the county road. The first farmer in line was Carl Dietrich, who had been bringing his grain to Millhaven for 20 years and who arrived at 6:15 a.m. with a full hopper of winter wheat and the expression of a man who has come to a familiar place and found it still standing. "Heard the Holyrood system is down," Carl said, while Walter was pulling the grain probe. "I heard the same thing," Walter said. "What about Selena?" Carl said. "Selena's running but they're backed up 3 days already," Walter said. "They're taking appointments." "Appointments," Carl said. He said it the way a farmer says something that represents a category of problem he would prefer not to have. "I don't take appointments," Walter said. He ran the probe across the sample, checked the moisture reading, looked at the test weight. 13.2 moisture. 60-pound test weight. Good grain. "I'll take it," Carl said. "I figured you would," Walter said. He filled out the ticket, the multi-part paper form, 1 copy for Carl, 1 copy for the elevator's records, 1 copy for the daily log. The pen moved across the paper with the efficiency of someone who has filled out the same form 10,000 times. By 10 a.m., 17 trucks were in line. By noon, 31. By 2 p.m., 44, and 3 of the trucks were from farms in the eastern part of the county that Walter had not seen at Millhaven in 15 years. Walter's daughter Marjorie, who handled the elevator's bookkeeping and office operations, drove out from her house in Ellsworth at 11 a.m. when Walter called her and said he needed help. "How many trucks?" she said when she arrived. 31 right now," Walter said. "I think we'll see 60 before the day is out." "The daily log is going to be full," Marjorie said. "Get another log," Walter said. She went to the office and called her husband to ask him to bring their 2 teenagers to help direct traffic, because the county road was becoming a problem. By the end of the first day, Walter had processed 67 loads. His normal peak day in a good harvest year was 42. Dale Whitfield drove to Holyrood on the morning of September 3 and stood in the facility manager's office looking at the diagnostic readout on the control system interface, which showed, in the specific and unhelpful way of systems that have failed, a series of error codes that were informative about what had gone wrong and uninformative about when it would be fixed. "What's the timeline?" he asked Jeff Poole, the facility manager. "The control board manufacturer says 6 to 8 weeks, Jeff said. "The board we need isn't in stock anywhere in the U.S. It's being manufactured and will be shipped from Germany." "Germany," Dale said. 6 to 8 weeks is the harvest," Dale said. "I know," Jeff said. "We can run 2 receiving lanes with the manual override protocol. Not 4. 2 lanes," Dale said. "What's your throughput capacity at 2 lanes?" Jeff told him. "Approximately 35% of the facility's normal capacity." Dale stood doing the arithmetic. Ellsworth County normally ran approximately 8 million bushels through the county's elevators in a harvest season. With Holyrood at 35% capacity and the two other facilities offline, the county's handling capacity was approximately 2.8 million bushels. The remaining 5.2 million bushels had to go somewhere. He thought about the presentation he had brought to Walter Brandt in 2020. The word he had used, anachronism. He thought about Walter's response, the specific calmness of a man who had been waiting for a question and had known what the answer was. "What's the capacity at Millhaven?" Dale said. "Walter Brandt's place? Maybe 1.5 million bushels for the season." "He's running," Dale said. "I heard," Jeff said. "He was running yesterday. Running today too." Dale looked at the diagnostic readout. "I need to call Walter Brandt," he said. "I figured you would," Jeff said. Dale called Walter at 11 a.m. on September 3rd, from the parking lot of the Holyrood facility. Walter answered on the third ring. "Walter," Dale said, "this is Dale Whitfield from AGP. I assume you've heard about the situation at Holyrood." "I've been watching the line on my county road," Walter said. "I have some understanding of the situation at Holyrood." "I'll be direct," Dale said. "We're going to have approximately 5 million bushels of grain in Ellsworth County that need to go somewhere during the next 6 to 8 weeks. You're running. We need capacity." "You need my capacity?" Walter said. "Yes," Dale said. "How much?" Walter said. Dale told him the numbers. Walter was quiet for a long moment. "My facility handles approximately 1.5 million bushels per season," Walter said. "In a normal year. I am not able to triple my throughput." "I know," Dale said. "I'm asking whether you can run at maximum capacity, extended hours, 7 days a week, and what that number looks like." "Extended hours, 7 days," Walter said. 2.5 million, maybe 2.8 if the weather cooperates and the grain is dry." "And what would it cost to run at that level for 6 to 8 weeks?" Dale said. Walter told him what the additional labor would cost, what the additional maintenance would cost, what the insurance and bonding implications were. Dale listened. "AGP will cover the additional operating costs," he said. "Plus a throughput fee per bushel." "That's not the conversation I want to have first," Walter said. Dale was quiet. "What conversation do you want to have first?" he said. "In 2020, Walter said, you brought a presentation to my office. You described the mechanical equipment here as an anachronism. You said the market had moved past it." "I remember," Dale said. "Before we discuss what I will charge," Walter said, "I want to know whether you are prepared to say, in whatever form is appropriate to your organization, that the assessment in that presentation was incomplete." Dale was quiet for a longer moment. He was a man who had been trained to present financial analyses and acquisition proposals, and he was being asked to say something honest that his training had not prepared him to say. "The assessment was accurate within its assumptions," Dale said finally. "The assumptions didn't include a semiconductor shortage, a heat event, and a 6-week harvest season disruption. Those were the conditions that existed in September 2021, Walter said. "Yes," Dale said. "The elevator that is running in September 2021, Walter said, is the elevator that was built in 1962 and maintained without modernization for 59 years. The elevators that are not running are the ones that were modernized." "Yes," Dale said. "So the assumptions were incomplete," Walter said. "The assumptions were incomplete," Dale said. "Come out tomorrow," Walter said. "We'll talk about the throughput arrangement. Bring someone who can sign an agreement." Marjorie Brandt was 42 years old and had been doing the Millhaven elevators bookkeeping since she was 23, when Walter had asked her to take over the financial side of the operation because he was better with machines than with numbers and because she had a degree in accounting from Fort Hays State and because, more than either of these reasons, she understood what the elevator was and cared about its survival in a way that a hired bookkeeper might not. She understood what the elevator was because she had grown up in it. She understood what it needed because she had been watching its financial position for 19 years. The financial position was this: the elevator was viable, consistently and sustainably viable, but never comfortable. The margins were thin enough that a bad harvest year, drought, or a quality problem that reduced test weights across the county, or a price collapse that led farmers to hold grain in their own bins rather than deliver, could create real pressure. The deferred maintenance list was always present. The conversations about whether to accept one of Dale Whitfield's acquisition offers had happened with more frequency and more seriousness than most people outside the family knew. She had been the one who tracked the deferred maintenance list. She knew every item on it by cost and priority. The north leg belt, $8, $400. The receiving pit cast iron grating, cracking in 2 places, $11, $200. The roof section over bin 3, leaking since 2019, $23.500. The exterior steel repainting at the seam welds where rust was beginning, $44,000. Total, $87,100. In 19 years of careful bookkeeping, she had never found a path to fund all 4 items simultaneously. The most she had managed in any single year was 1 item, and only in good years. She was in the office on the afternoon of September 3rd, processing the tickets from the day's record throughput, when Walter told her about the call from Dale Whitfield. "He wants to formalize a throughput arrangement," Walter said. Marjorie looked at the stack of tickets on the desk, 67 loads, more than in any single day she could remember. She thought about the deferred maintenance list that had been on her desk for 3 years. "What throughput fee is he offering?" she said. Walter told her. She wrote the number down and did the arithmetic. At that fee, over 6 weeks at maximum capacity, the crisis revenue would exceed the elevator's normal annual revenue. She looked at the number for a long time. Not with surprise, she had been doing financial projections for 19 years and she understood what she was calculating, but with the specific quality of attention she brought to numbers that were going to change something. "The deferred maintenance list," she said. "I know," Walter said. "All of it," she said. "At the throughput fee he's offering, we could fund all of it and have reserves." "Yes," Walter said. "Tell him we want the rate he mentioned plus 10%, Walter said. "As a reliability premium." "You think he'll pay the premium?" Marjorie said. "I think he'll pay it," Walter said, "because he doesn't have a choice that costs him less." She picked up the phone to start the conversation about numbers. Before she did, she made a note in the margin of the day's accounting sheet, the throughput that couldn't be generated in normal conditions. The value that was invisible for 31 years. The deferred maintenance that existed because there was never enough margin. All of it connected. She would develop this observation more fully later, when the accounting of the full 6 weeks was complete. The 6 weeks from September 2nd to October 14th, 2021 were the most demanding operating period in the history of the Millhaven elevator. Walter ran the facility from 5:30 a.m. to 9 p.m. 7 days a week. He hired 3 temporary workers, 2 farmers' sons between harvests, and a retired railroad worker named Dennis who had grown up around mechanical equipment and who understood the leg bucket system intuitively from the first day. His nephew Carl came for 3 weeks during the peak. Marjorie came every day. Her husband Frank managed traffic on the county road, working with the county sheriff's department to create a temporary staging area in a field that a neighboring farmer had offered at no charge. The line was present every morning when Walter arrived and present every evening when he locked the receiving pit. On the peak day, September 17th, when a weather window between 2 storm systems created ideal harvest conditions and every farmer in the county tried to bring grain simultaneously, the line stretched 2 miles and Walter processed 94 loads between 5:30 a.m. and 9 p.m. He processed them with the 1962 leg bucket system and the mechanical scale and the paper ticketing. There were no software errors. There were no control board failures. There were no days when the receiving system was offline because a component was unavailable from a factory in Germany. There were 3 mechanical issues. The first was on September 9th, when the north leg belt developed a squeal that Walter identified as a bearing beginning to fail at 7:15 a.m. He stopped the leg, replaced the bearing, a repair he had done before and had the parts for, and had the system running again by 9:45 a.m. Total downtime, 2 hours and 30 minutes. The line waited. The second was on September 22nd, when a bucket cracked on the south leg. Walter saw it on his morning inspection and had the bucket replaced before the 6 a.m. opening. Total downtime, 0. The third was on October 3rd, when the receiving pit's west wall scale bracket cracked under the load of continuous operation. Walter had Dennis weld a reinforcement plate while the east scale continued to operate. Partial throughput reduction for 4 hours. 3 mechanical issues, all repaired with on-hand parts and on-site skills. Total operational downtime, approximately 3 hours over 6 weeks. The Holyrood facility, working with its manual override on 2 lanes, had 6 control system failures during the same period. Each required a service call from the manufacturer's technician. Average downtime per incident, 11 hours. Walter tracked the comparison in the daily log that he kept by hand in the office. He did not show the log to Dale Whitfield. He did not need to. The farmers who came to Millhaven in September 2021 included farmers who had been coming for 31 years and farmers who had not been to Millhaven in 15 years. For the longtime farmers, the 6 weeks were a confirmation of something they already knew. The specific quality of a place where the person running the operation knew your name and knew your ground and could look at your grain sample and tell you something about the quality before the meter confirmed it. For the farmers who had left for Holyrood, the 6 weeks were an education. Tom Reifschneider had been bringing his grain to Holyrood since 2006, when Holyrood opened its new facility with electronic receiving and digital weight systems and a merchandising office that could offer corn futures contracts and basis services that Millhaven couldn't match. He had made the decision rationally. He drove to Millhaven on September 4 because he had no other option, and he watched Walter pull a grain probe and look at the sample and say 14.1 moisture, looks like good test weight, before the moisture meter confirmed 14.2 and the scale showed 62 pounds per bushel. How did you know? Tom said. The kernel feel, Walter said, rubbing a few kernels between his fingers. When the moisture is above 14, the kernels have a slight flex to them. Below 13, they're rigid. Between 13 and 14, it depends on the variety. This is one of the Milo's varieties, I recognize it. Always runs about a tenth high on the meter. Tom looked at him. You recognize the variety? I've been seeing it for 15 years, Walter said. Your neighbor Carl plants it. You started growing it 2, 3 years ago? 3 years ago, Tom said. It's good grain, Walter said. You grew it well. Tom drove out thinking about what it had felt like to have someone who knew what they were looking at look at his grain. He had not felt that at Holyrood. Holyrood's system had processed his grain accurately and efficiently and had generated a digital ticket uploaded to his account. It had not recognized the variety. It had not known his neighbor's planting history. It had not said, you grew it well. Dale Whitfield drove to Millhaven on September 8 for the meeting that Walter had requested. He arrived at 8 a.m. and the line was already 18 trucks long. He parked at the edge of the property and watched for 45 minutes before Walter had time to sit down with him. What he watched was Walter Brandt receiving trucks in a continuous flow, pulling samples, running them through the moisture meter and the scale, filling out tickets, moving to the next truck, while simultaneously listening to the leg system with the specific quality of attention of someone monitoring a machine as part of the background process of doing everything else. The operation was not flashy. It was not technologically sophisticated. It would not show well in a capital efficiency analysis. It was running. Dale thought about his 3 presentations to Walter over the previous years. The capital analysis. The market share data. The word anachronism. He thought about Walter's response in the 2020 meeting. I'm interested in what the market looks like in abnormal conditions. You've been watching for a while, Walter said, when he finally sat down with Dale in the small office adjacent to the receiving area. I have, Dale said. What did you see? Walter said. It was a genuine question. Dale was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had been trained to present financial analyses, and he was being asked to say something honest that his training had not prepared him to say. I saw an elevator running, he said. In the middle of the most significant supply chain disruption this county has seen in 20 years, I saw an elevator running. Yes, Walter said. And I saw farmers who are glad it's running, Dale said. Yes, Walter said. I called the mechanical equipment an anachronism, Dale said. In this office. 2 years ago. You did, Walter said. I was using a standard capital analysis, Dale said. The standard analysis doesn't include a value for resilience. For being the elevator that's still running when the others aren't. How much is that worth? Walter said. Dale did not have a number ready, because this was not a question his training had prepared him to answer precisely. More than the acquisition price I offered you in 2018, he said. Yes, Walter said. It is. The throughput agreement between the Millhaven elevator and AGP was signed on September 10. The terms were, AGP would pay Walter's standard service charge plus a 15% reliability premium on every bushel processed through Millhaven during the crisis period. AGP would also provide temporary liability coverage for the additional throughput and would pay for any capital repairs to the Millhaven facility that became necessary during the extended operating period. The agreement also included a section that Walter had drafted himself. The section read, AGP acknowledges that the Millhaven elevator's continued operational capability during the September to October 2021 supply chain disruption was the result of decisions made by Walter Brandt and, before him, by Henry Brandt, to maintain mechanical equipment that could be repaired and maintained with locally available skills and parts rather than equipment dependent on supply chains for specialized components. AGP acknowledges that the standard capital analysis applied in AGP's previous acquisition negotiations with the Millhaven elevator did not adequately account for the value of operational resilience that results from these equipment and maintenance decisions. AGP further acknowledges that characterizations of this equipment as an anachronism were based on assumptions that the events of September 2021 have demonstrated to be incomplete. Dale's legal department had suggested removing this section as commercially unnecessary. Dale had kept it in. He had kept it in because Walter had said, "I'm not asking you to feel bad about the acquisition offers. I'm asking you to say in writing what the situation has demonstrated. So that the next time someone at AGP looks at an independent elevator's mechanical equipment and calls it an anachronism, there is a document in the file that says something different." Dale had thought about this for 3 days before deciding that the section was fair. He had also thought about what Gary Tanner would say. He had called Gary on the second day. "I was wrong about Millhaven," Dale said. "You were using the standard assumptions," Gary said. "The standard assumptions were incomplete," Dale said. "Yes," Gary said. "That's what Walter would say." "What would you say?" Dale said. Gary was quiet for a moment. "I'd say the standard assumptions are right 95% of the time," Gary said. "The question is what you build for the other 5%. Tom Reifschneider had brought his grain to Millhaven for 6 weeks in September and October 2021, and at the end of October, when the Holyrood facility had restored full operations, he sat at his kitchen table and thought about what he was going to do. He was 51 years old and farmed 100 acres in the eastern part of Ellsworth County. He made farm management decisions based on economics. He did the calculation that the situation required. The relevant factors were the service charge, the price differential, the transportation cost difference. Millhaven was 4 miles closer to his farm, and the factor he had not previously included, the risk of facility unavailability during harvest. For 15 years, he had assigned this risk a probability of approximately 0. The assumption had been wrong in September 2021. He looked at the 6 weeks. He had delivered approximately 145,000 bushels to Millhaven during the disruption. If Millhaven had not been available, his options would have been deliver to Holyrood's reduced capacity operation and wait, which would have cost him approximately 30 days of additional harvest delay given the backlog, or truck the grain 45 miles to Salina at an additional 12 cents per bushel in transportation. At 145,000 bushels, the transportation cost differential alone was $17.400. The delay cost, yield loss and quality deterioration from leaving grain in the field an additional 30 days, he estimated at $22,000 to $30,000. Total avoided cost from Millhaven being available, approximately $40,000 to $48,000. He looked at the price differential between Millhaven and Holyrood in a normal year, approximately 1.5 cents per bushel. On 145,000 bushels, that was $2.175 per year. To capture an average annual benefit of $2.175, he had been accepting an option value exposure of $40,000 to $48,000 per disruption event. He called Millhaven the next morning. "I want to divide my grain marketing," he told Walter. "At least 30% of my bushels going through Millhaven going forward." "Why dividing?" Walter asked. "Because Holyrood's pricing and services are genuinely better in a normal year," Tom said. "And because you can't handle all of my grain. But I want at least 30% going through a facility I know will be running." 30% is about 43,000 bushels for you, Walter said. "About that," Tom said. "I'll take it," Walter said. Marjorie Brandt sat at the desk in the elevator office in November 2021 and did the full accounting of the 6 weeks, the accounting she had been building toward since the note she wrote in the margin of the day's accounting sheet on September 3. Total bushels processed, 714,000. Against Walter's normal seasonal throughput of approximately 100,000 to 400,000 bushels. Revenue from throughput fees and the AGP reliability premium, substantially above the elevator's normal annual revenue. She wrote down the specific number and looked at it for a long time before continuing. She had joined the elevator's operations 19 years ago, and in those 19 years she had watched her father run an operation that was financially sustainable but never comfortable. The deferred maintenance list had been present since 2015. The conversations about Dale Whitfield's acquisition offers had happened with more frequency and more seriousness than most people outside the family knew. She had been part of those conversations, had done the calculations on both sides, had understood why the offer was tempting and why her father had declined. She listed what had changed. The deferred maintenance was fully funded. The $87.100 list, the north leg belt, the pit grading, the roof section, the exterior steel, was funded from the crisis season's revenue, with meaningful reserves remaining. The elevator's equity position was stronger than it had ever been in her 19 years of bookkeeping. Several farmers who had been using Holyrood exclusively had called to establish accounts at Millhaven. The new accounts represented approximately 340,000 bushels of additional annual throughput, a 25 to 30% increase in the elevator's sustainable base. And the AGP agreement, with its acknowledgement section, was in the file. She took out the note from September 3 and read it: the throughput that couldn't be generated in normal conditions. The value that was invisible for 31 years. The deferred maintenance that existed because there was never enough margin. All of it connected. She wrote the full version now, at the bottom of the accounting document. The value of resilience is not visible in normal years. It accumulates as an option, the right to be the last elevator running when the others can't. The option had no visible value for 31 years. In September 2021, the option was exercised. The option was worth more than the sum of all the acquisition offers. She also wrote, the elevator belongs to the community. The value of the option, the 6 weeks of crisis revenue, should be returned, at least in part, to the farmers who depend on the elevator. How? She brought this question to Walter. Walter Brandt sat at the kitchen table in November 2021 and looked at the accounting and thought about his father's card in the desk drawer. What are your options? Marjorie said. The deferred maintenance, Walter said. That's already decided. Yes, she said. The rest? Walter thought for a long time. The elevator was his, legally. He had earned the crisis revenue through 31 years of decisions that had kept the mechanical equipment operational, and through 6 weeks of 16-hour days, and through the specific value that the elevator had provided when the county needed it. He was entitled to it. The farmers who came during the crisis paid the normal service charge, Walter said. I charged them the standard rate. Yes, Marjorie said. The throughput premium came from AGP. The farmers came to me because I was the only place running, Walter said. They didn't have a choice. They got a fair price, Marjorie said. They got the standard rate when they had no alternative, Walter said. Which is a different economic position than the standard rate when they have 3 choices. Marjorie looked at him. You want to return some of the premium to the farmers. I want to build a reserve fund, Walter said. Managed by a board that includes farmers from the county. The reserve fund pays for the elevator's ongoing capital maintenance, the costs of keeping the mechanical equipment operational, so that when the next disruption comes, the elevator is still running. And it provides a small patronage credit to farmers who have been delivering consistently. A cooperative structure, Marjorie said. Essentially, Walter said. A trust arrangement. The way my father described it. Marjorie looked at the accounting. If you fund the reserve at the level I'm calculating, she said, you retain enough to be comfortable. Comfortable is what I've always been, Walter said. Comfortable is sufficient. She drafted the trust document over the following 2 weeks. The document established the reserve fund, the board of farmer representatives, the capital maintenance mandate, and the patronage credit program. It also established that in the event of Walter's retirement or death, the first right of purchase for the elevator property went to the trust, at a price determined by independent appraisal, before any sale to outside parties. The AGP acquisition offer would not be the first call. Dale Whitfield submitted a report to AGP's Strategic Planning Committee in December 2021, covering the September to October supply chain disruption and its implications for the cooperative's elevator network. The report was thorough, covering the technical failures, the timeline, the operational impact, and the cost, approximately $4.2 million in reduced throughput revenue and emergency repair costs across the affected facilities. It also included a section titled, Resilience Value in Grain Elevator Infrastructure. The section described the performance of the Millhaven elevator during the crisis period. It described the Brandt's equipment and maintenance philosophy. It described the AGP acknowledgement agreement and what it said. And it said, the standard capital analysis applied to independent elevator acquisitions in this region does not include a value for operational resilience, the ability to continue operating during supply chain disruptions, equipment failures, or other events that disable facilities dependent on specialized electronic components. The Millhaven elevator's performance during the 2021 crisis demonstrates that this value is real, significant, and should be included in any analysis of elevator network composition. Recommendation: AGP's equipment modernization strategy should include a resilience assessment that evaluates the concentration risk created by uniform dependence on the same electronic control system manufacturers. Independent facilities with mechanical equipment should be viewed as resilience assets for the regional grain handling network rather than as declining operators with obsolete equipment. He presented the report to the Strategic Planning Committee in January 2022. After the meeting, Gary Tanner found Dale in the corridor. "The report is right," Gary said. "I know," Dale said. "The committee isn't going to act on it immediately," Gary said. "I know," Dale said. "The next disruption will be more persuasive than the report." "Yes," Gary said. He looked at Dale. "You learned something from Walter Brandt." "I learned that the assumptions I was using were incomplete," Dale said. Gary nodded. "That's what learning looks like," he said. "Walter wouldn't call it anything fancier than that." In the winter of 2021, after the harvest was settled and the accounting was done and the trust document was signed and the deferred maintenance was funded, Walter Brandt sat in the elevator office and opened the desk drawer and took out the card. Henry Brandt's clear, old-school cursive. The card said, "The elevator belongs to the farmers, not to us. We run it for them, not for ourselves. When you make decisions about the elevator, make them the way a trustee makes decisions about a trust, for the benefit of the people who depend on it, not for the convenience of the person managing it." Walter had read the card many times over 28 years. He had read it when the first acquisition offer came in 2004, and when the second came in 2011, and when the three from Dale Whitfield came in 2018 and 2019 and 2020. He had read it when the capital maintenance costs were high and the margins were thin and the case for selling had looked stronger than it ever quite looked strong enough to act on. He read it now. He put the card back in the drawer. Then he took it out again and looked at it once more. He thought about his father, who had built the elevator in 1962 with a small business loan and a conviction about what the community needed. Who had run it through the farm crisis of the 1980s, when a third of Ellsworth County's farms went through foreclosure and the farmers who survived needed every cooperative institution they could hold on to. Who had transmitted the conviction along with the knowledge of how to run the leg bucket system and how to read grain quality by hand and how to maintain a mechanical scale. The conviction and the knowledge were the same transmission. Henry had never called his equipment an anachronism. He had never thought of it in those terms. It was equipment that could be maintained by the person operating it, with parts that could be sourced from suppliers who had been selling those parts for 60 years and would continue to sell them. This was not a nostalgic preference. It was a design principle. Walter put the card back in the drawer, in the same position it had been for 28 years. Marjorie Brandt's son Jacob was 24 years old in 2021 and had a degree in agricultural business from Kansas State University and had been working at the elevator part-time since he was a teenager. He had also interned at Holyrood the summer after his sophomore year, in the merchandising office, and had come away with two things: a clear understanding of what the large computerized facilities could do, and a question he had never quite resolved: why did Millhaven feel like a more alive place than Holyrood, given that Holyrood had better technology, better prices, and more services? He had been trying to answer this question since that summer. The 2021 crisis gave him part of the answer. He sat with Walter in the office one evening in October, after the last truck had been processed and the leg system had been shut down for the night. "The mechanical equipment," he said. "The 1962 leg system, the mechanical scale, the paper tickets. You've maintained all of it for 31 years at a cost that the standard analysis says wasn't justified." "The standard analysis was incomplete," Walter said. "The difference matters." "Why does the difference matter?" Jacob said. "Because saying the analysis was wrong suggests that the people doing the analysis were incompetent," Walter said. "They weren't. They were using the standard methodology, which doesn't include a value for resilience. The methodology was incomplete. That's a different problem, with a different solution." "What's the solution?" Jacob said. "Building a methodology that includes resilience," Walter said. "Which is what Dale Whitfield's report is trying to do. And what Marjorie's note in the accounting document is trying to do." Jacob thought about this. "You could have modernized," he said. "The analysis showed that modernizing might have improved the margins." "It might have," Walter said. "Why didn't you?" Jacob said. Walter was quiet for a moment. "Because the mechanical equipment can be understood and maintained by the people who operate it," he said. "The computerized equipment requires a supply chain that I cannot control. When the supply chain works, the computerized equipment is better, faster, more accurate, more data. When the supply chain breaks, it's nothing. My equipment is not better in normal conditions. It is reliable in all conditions." "The reliability is worth something," Jacob said. "The reliability is worth what you saw in September," Walter said. "And what you didn't see in the 30 Septembers before that, when the supply chain worked and the reliability was invisible." Jacob looked at the paper ticket forms on the desk and the daily log on the shelf and the mechanical scale visible through the window. "When you retire," He said, "What happens to this?" "The trust has first right of purchase," Walter said. "And if I wanted to run it?" Jacob said. Walter looked at his grandson. Jacob was 24 years old and had a degree in agricultural business and understood both what the standard analysis said and why it was incomplete. "Can you maintain the leg system?" Walter said. "I've been watching you maintain it for 20 years, Jacob said. "I can do the routine maintenance. The major work, the bearing replacements, the belt changes, I'd need to learn." "Dennis retired last month," Walter said. "He knows the system. He said he'd teach you if you asked." Jacob looked at him. "You already talked to him?" "He came up in conversation," Walter said. Jacob smiled, the specific smile of someone who recognizes that a plan has been made on their behalf with enough tact to appear unmade. "What's the first thing I need to learn?" he said. "How to listen to the leg system," Walter said. "Everything else follows from that." The Millhaven elevator opened for the 2023 harvest season on the first Tuesday of September, as it had opened for the harvest season on the first Tuesday of September, or the closest Monday to September 1st when the calendar required, for 61 consecutive years. Walter Brandt was 69 years old and was no longer running the receiving area. His hips had been replaced in March and his doctor had told him that 16-hour days were no longer appropriate. Walter had agreed, because he was a man who listened to accurate assessments of conditions and acted accordingly. Jacob was running the receiving area. He was 26 years old and had been full-time at the elevator since February 2022, when Walter had formally handed over the daily operations. He had spent the winter of 2021 to 2022 with Dennis, learning the leg bucket system the way Walter had learned it from Henry, not from a manual but from the specific education of working alongside someone who knew what they were doing and who asked questions and waited for the answers. Jacob had learned quickly. Not because he was exceptional but because he had been absorbing the elevator since he was a child, building the background pattern recognition that made the explicit instruction legible when it came. He was at the receiving area at 6 a.m. when the first truck arrived. The first truck was Carl Dietrich's, which had been the first truck at the Millhaven receiving area on the first day of harvest for 22 years. "Morning, Jacob," Carl said. "Morning, Carl," Jacob said. He pulled the grain probe and ran the sample. "Good color on this. Looks dry." 13.8 on my meter at home, Carl said. Jacob ran the sample through the moisture meter. 13.9, he said. "Close." He filled out the ticket, the paper ticket, the multi-part form. The pen moved across the paper with the efficiency of someone who was still building the 10,000 repetitions but who was clearly building them. Walter was in the office, visible through the window, reading the daily log from the previous year's harvest. He was not operating. He was present. He was present the way Henry had been present in his last years, not running the operation but available for the questions that the operation eventually produced, the questions that required more than the manual could answer. The leg system was running. Jacob had done his morning check before the first truck arrived, pressing his hand against the conveyor housing to feel the bearing temperature, listening to the drive motor, watching the bucket movement for the slight irregularities that preceded a problem. He had learned the sounds. He had not yet learned all of what the sounds meant, but he was learning them in the only way they could be learned, by listening, every morning, and writing down what he heard and what happened afterward. His notebook was in his shirt pocket. By 9 a.m. there were 14 trucks in line. Tom Reifschneider arrived with his third load of the season, his fourth year of splitting his grain marketing between Millhaven and Holyrood. "Splitting still working for you?" Jacob asked, while he pulled the sample. "Working fine," Tom said. "Holyrood had a minor system issue last week. Back up in a day. Nothing like 2021. "Let's hope it stays that way," Jacob said. "Let's hope," Tom said. "But it's good to know you're running." Jacob handed him his ticket and moved to the next truck. Walter, in the office window, watched the receiving area with the specific quality of attention of a man who has handed something over and is watching to see how it is held. It was being held correctly. He went back to the daily log. The leg system ran. The line moved. The grain came in. The consolidation of independent grain elevators in the United States is real. From approximately 10,000 country elevators in 1980, the number had fallen to fewer than 3,000 by 2020, driven by consolidation, capital requirements, and competitive pressure from larger regional operations. The global semiconductor shortage of 2021 is real, and its effects on agricultural equipment and related technology were documented across multiple industries. The vulnerability of computerized grain handling control systems to component supply chain disruption is a real category of risk that has received increased attention in agricultural infrastructure discussions since 2021. Leg bucket elevator systems, mechanical conveyors using buckets attached to a continuous belt to move grain vertically, are real and have been in use since the 19th century. Elevators with vintage mechanical equipment of the kind described in this novel exist and operate in various parts of the United States. The concept of operational resilience value, the economic value of the ability to continue operating during disruptions that disable less resilient competitors, is a real concept in operations management and supply chain theory, though its application to grain elevator infrastructure has received limited formal treatment. The trust structure described in this novel, combining a capital reserve fund with farmer governance and right of first purchase provisions, draws on elements of existing farmer-owned grain cooperatives while remaining a fictional construct. Walter Brandt, Henry Brandt, Marjorie Brandt, Jacob Brandt, Dale Whitfield, Gary Tanner, Tom Reifschneider, Carl Dietrich, and all other characters are fictional. Ellsworth County, Kansas is real. Marjorie's calculation is fictional. The arithmetic it represents is not.